Things I won't get. I thought about all the nights I'd come in late when she was already in bed. I'd quietly undress and lie beside her, wondering if she was awake. The silence of the room was cold and unforgiving, leaving only the muffled sound of breathing to lull me to sleep. But I always found it hard to sleep with her next to me, unsure of how she felt and what she thought. We'd grown so far apart that even thinking of her was awkward. We avoided each other as much as we could. I found it hardest when we were together, though. I was as much a ghost to her as she was to me. The last word I'd heard her say had been to someone on the phone just before she'd noticed me watching her. The image keeps replaying in my head, how quickly the smile had fallen from her face when she'd seen me. Her whisper to the phone as she hurried away upstairs. When had she last smiled at me like that? How had we gotten to this point? I wish now that I'd seen it happening, that if only I'd reached out to her, maybe things would be better. My mind was screaming at me to just talk to her, to tell her that I hated this, that I wanted to love her, to be loved by her the way that we once had. I wanted to, but any time I almost worked up the courage, I fell short. When I woke up on Thursday, she'd already left the house to go to work. The air still felt heavy despite her absence. I tried to hum merrily as I got ready to leave myself, but soon gave up. Somehow I felt I deserved the silence that had taken over my life. The whole world was so alive and loud, but it didn't ever seem to reach me anymore. It had been drowned out by the silence. Even my own thoughts were quiet, as though thinking itself was an intruder. I got on with my work and sat alone at lunch. Before I knew what was happening, I'd been attacked by a memory. Fridays used to be our date night. We often didn't have the money to go out, so instead we'd buy cheap wine and sit at the table with a candle in between us, pretending we were at some fancy restaurant. We'd laugh and talk, letting the hours slip by like running smooth hair through fingers, until the cheapness of the wine didn't matter. Nothing mattered because we had the whole world between us. It hurt me in a way I couldn't handle. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they came back harder. For the rest of the day, I wrestled with the thoughts. I hated them for disturbing the silence I'd spent so long making my home. I hated those memories because it felt like someone had taken a dagger to my chest in an effort to murder any peace I might have. Was it really peace that was trapped in my ribcage, or was it in fact a longing, yearning for something I no longer had? Perhaps the dagger was only trying to cut out a hole for the pain to escape. I avoided the living room entirely that night, afraid of feeding the memories and letting them get stronger. It's not as though I needed to go in there anyway. I barely ate anymore. Friday woke me up with a plan to break the silence once and for all. I was terrified. Once it was broken, it couldn't be undone. There was so much potential for this to work, but there was even more for it to fail. I wasn't sure if it was worth pursuing. The only thing that urged me to go through it was the fear of the dagger, digging deeper into me. The fear was eating me up. My thoughts had started to grow louder, but was still hesitant. For so long they'd been drowned out, I couldn't blame them for wanting to stay in line, in their comfort zone. But a revolution was brewing. That night, on my way home, I stopped by the local supermarket and picked up a cheap bottle of wine and some groceries. I felt nervous, as though I was stealing it. It was something I shouldn't be doing. I focused on the meal I was going to serve. Stuffed mushrooms. They were a favourite of ours. We used to joke about how posh they were. A silly little luxury back then. My hands shook as I prepared everything. She wouldn't be home for another hour. I had plenty of time. I paced up and down in front of the living room door, trying to brace myself. This was ridiculous. It was only a door. So why couldn't I open it? Slowly, I turned the handle and pushed against the hard wood. Cold air ran over my skin and I shivered. It seemed to wash the fear off of me and I became excited, gently setting the table ready for our date. I laid out our plates, moving them several times each ever so slightly until they looked right. Just as I was lighting the candle, I heard the door open and shut. Everything became real then. She was really here. We were really doing this. I listened to her hanging her keys up, putting her bag down, taking her coat and shoes off. She began walking to the stairs and entered my field of vision. I watched as she slowed down and sniffed the air. Her head turned to face me. It felt how stalkers and perverts must feel when they get caught by their muse. The breath caught in my throat. She walked slowly towards me, breaking what was the first eye contact we'd made in weeks, to look at the table. There was recognition in her eyes, yet still that cold, that silence lingered. My heart hammered in my ears as she took the seat opposite me. We sat like that for a while, what felt like hours, before I picked up my knife and fork and began to eat. After a while she followed suit and we both ate in silence. "For fuck's sake," she yelled, throwing down her cutlery and standing up. I was in shock. The noise deafened me. The silence had been shattered. All I could do was stammer. A wave of fear and hurt came over me as tears started to fall down her cheeks. "What the hell did you think was going to happen? What were you trying to achieve?" she yelled, recoiling from me as if I were a leper when I reached out my hand to her. I'm so sorry." Now we were both crying. I'd never felt so much hostility between us both. I didn't know what was happening or how to deal with it. I had no idea what had built up or why. Just don't." Her hands tensed in front of her face as she spoke and returned to her sides as she ran from me up the stairs. In a moment of anger, I dammed my cheap wine and threw the glass against the wall. My face twisted at the bitterness as I watched it shatter. I felt myself shatter with it and sank to the floor, sobbing. I slept on the sofa that night. She was gone again when I woke up the next morning. She didn't return home for the rest of the week. I even tried texting her to see if she was okay. I'd become even more worried by Monday. I'd been checking the news every few hours, hoping I wouldn't see her there. The weekend had dragged. I'd hardly left my room. Most of my time had been spent sleeping, accompanied by several hours of staring at the bare walls or ceiling, unable to sleep. It was quiet, but not silent, not the way it used to be. I didn't know how much longer I could live like this. Work on Monday was only a little refreshing, but the longer I was forced to stay present, the more I wanted to never be present again. I didn't have much to lose anymore. I'd just lost the one thing that meant more to me than anything else I ever had. I walked into my house that night, unsure of whether I'd ever walk out. At least the silence had been numb. This was just agony. I froze when I saw her sitting on the sofa, so beautiful yet filled with so much sadness. She stood up, and almost without thinking, we both found ourselves locked in a tight embrace. Finally, the closeness we'd once had was here again. I hadn't thought it possible. Both of us cried on the other, but when we pulled apart to look at each other, there was a smile on her face, and then mine. I hadn't realised that as long as she hadn't smiled at me, I hadn't smiled at her either. I hadn't smiled at anyone. We kissed then, and laughed and hugged, and I suggested that we both sit down to a nice cup of tea. It felt much more like we were old friends catching up than lovers who'd fallen apart. "I'm sorry I left you the other day. I didn't know how to handle everything. I didn't know why, but I hated you. That you were trying to talk to me because we weren't supposed to talk to each other. I didn't know why." She spoke so softly. It was good to hear her voice again. I didn't know why what she'd said made sense, but it did. "Honestly, I thought I'd lost you properly this time. I already thought I'd lost you in my life." I didn't want to finish that thought. "I'm just glad that you're back. Really back. I mean, not just physically." We had so much to talk about, so much to catch up on. I didn't think either of us really understood the situation, how any two people could fall out silently. It was as though at some point we'd both become scared to talk about how we felt until we were too frightened to talk about anything at all. We knew that we had to talk now. It was so painfully obvious that it was now or never, and we'd both decided to grab the bull by the horns. We talked and talked for hours, sitting on the floor with our mugs of tea, laughing about silly things. My personality had returned. I now had a full range of emotions and possibilities. Maybe if I was lucky, I could find a better job, buy a car. Sure, I'd never have as much as some people, but now I was okay with that. I didn't need what other people had because I had the whole world between me and her. That night we went to bed together. I watched her as she drifted off. She was so perfect and wonderful. She understood me. She didn't need to be something I wasn't because I was enough. For the first time in a long time, I fell asleep, content and hopeful.